Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. Different continent, different issue, but I hope you stay with me. This is part of a larger project, and I did it with a postdoc from UNESCO IHE indeed, and we are in the Mekong Delta, and in particular the Chinese part, and we were studying the effects of climate change on farmers and entrepreneurs in the rural areas. And in the case of the Mekong Delta, particularly the Chinese part, this boils down to more drought. So we're very much looking at what is China doing to deal with more drought. And I pay a lot of attention to the governance structure. So how does it work? Where are the policies formulated? Are they implemented? Do they have the desired effect? And then at the end, we look at the rural areas to see how these entrepreneurs and farmers deal with that particular governance structure and gradually start developing their own governance structures. That's the interesting part of it. So here are the research questions, the policies, the organizational framework for climate change in China and how they are implemented. And today the emphasis is on the last point, what the effects of these policies are for the farmers and the rural entrepreneurs. So the fieldwork was done in two smaller districts, very much in the south. And so my postdoc is shown here on the right, interviewing people after doing a content study of all the documents to find out what the policies were, to be able to find out to what extent these policies worked out at the local level, what he's doing on the right. And then conceptually, we said what is happening is influenced by the policies, by the institutions, and then the local organizations, which are in particular the local government, the farmer organizations, and the enterprises in the rural areas. So this is the policy framework in China, and as we expected in a communist country, it's very much hierarchical and top-down. And so what you see is the national laws eventually need to be implemented through ordinances. And that can happen at the local level, it can happen in different departments. And so what we learned from the review of the current policies is that there is a lot of gaps and overlap. And so when the Chinese became aware of that, they started to organize it differently and use the national ordinances to get a more harmonious implementation of all these laws. So these are the most important ones, and you see it started in 2007, and a lot of it is at the national level, important reports assessing the situation, translating it into policies and activities to cope with climate change. And a very important one is this going for creating committees. And I will show you later on that this is a new phenomenon in the governance structure in China. So we have visualized it differently here, with on the one axis the time path, and on the other the level of legislation, with the laws at the national level, the ordinances at lower levels, and then departmental rules at the lowest level. Now what you see is that in the beginning of 2000, a lot of these departmental rules were used for implementation. And when that didn't work, they resorted back to the ordinances, which are from a slightly higher level and better able to coordinate the different climate change policies in the Chinese context. So as some of the examples of policies introduced in China for adapting to the new situation of more drought. There was a lot of relief of information and technology. There were programs improving the farmers' income, and we discussed during the break, to what extent these have been successful. But it ranged from temporary jobs in the urban areas to improving the existing system of informal transfer of land rights to something that is now formally recognized. So you don't have property rights, but you can transfer your user rights. For example, when you migrate temporarily to the city and you don't want to give up your rural base, you can do it, which of course then allows another farmer to achieve some economies of scale. Well, there are then a lot of agricultural subsidies, and in our calculations they were as good as 1/5 of the rural incomes. So these are substantial, in particular when the Chinese abolished most of the hated rural agricultural taxes. And then there is specific equipment for the drought areas. There is a loan system and an insurance system. And then, we thought it was also important to look at the social capital at the lowest level, to what extent people trying to mobilize the people for this purpose through drought relief teams, through water user associations, and how communities could raise money for this purpose. Now, this is again all the ministries involved in yellow. And then the new phenomenon, that's the creation of the coordinating committees. And we've depicted 4 here. And one of the important ones is disaster alleviation and then the drought relief. And that's relevant for my story. And this is relevant, of course, for these 2 days as one of the topics. Then here is a coordinating committee for poverty alleviation and one for coping with climate change. So you see again that climate change is here on the left side in this committee. At the same time it is on the right side in these 2 committees. So this more polycentric governance structure has not solved all the problems of policy gaps and policy overlaps. So some conclusions on this governance part. Let me give them all, then I will just select a few because of the time. So I think the first one is extremely important, the very hierarchical structure in the Chinese context. And the number 4, that these policies are often considered as very paternalistic, helping the farmers and the rural entrepreneurs, but not involving them in the decision making. So it's not based on a participatory approach. And so what you see, in fact, at the local level as a consequence is that the Chinese government seems to be retreating from village affairs. And let me illustrate that through this slide on multi-level government in China. The interesting part is the community, what is sometimes called the natural village. And they are autonomous in the sense that there are no paid government officials at that level. So at that level, people select their leaders. They don't even have to be member of the Communist Party. They're just local leaders, which then try to mobilize funds and other resources at the level of the administrative village. Of course, in this hierarchy, the county level is extremely important, because that is the level where the land rights are distributed. Well, this is kind of the summary of the first part of the research, where we have all the different policies, and through the different colors we try to show what has happened, to what extent it's just guidelines at the national and the provincial level, or to what extent it works through at the community level. So here you see the different levels, different policies, and the colors indicate to what extent these are legally binding obligations, to what extent it's incentives, or whether it is even implies that you can have this service, but you would have to pay for it. So it's one way of summarizing all the existing policies in this respect. Another one was, looking at that multi-level governance structure with the 7 levels of governance, to what extent they have a committee at each level or not. And so you see here the first 4 are these 4 committees that I showed in the earlier slide in the vertical way. And you immediately notice that some of them have no policy at the municipal level, no policy at the county level, and sometimes even no leading committee at the county level, such as this committee on coping with climate change. It has no leading committee there and no policy there. So then of course it's also difficult to expect that they have an impact at that level. Here we singled out just for policies for flood control, how in the Chinese context, you go from the highest level to the lowest level, and what are all the bureaucratic levels you have to pass through, all the procedures you have to follow. So it does show the complexity in this big country. So again, some conclusions for this part, and the first one is what we found is quite interesting, that in fact the hierarchical relations between the national and the provincial level are not necessarily repeated between the provincial level and the county level, and eventually these administrative and natural villages. So you get more what I call polycentric governance structures at these lower levels. We also found that there is more space for the local governments to adopt a more comprehensive approach compared to the national government, which is so compartmentalized. We found most national policies have been translated into local policies. You remember all these crosses, but local governments also have developed policies based on their own goals. So there is another noise in the system, if you want, or more decentralized dealing with the problem, if you want to interpret it more positive. I also indicated that not everything is free, and finally that in the end the funds and the subsidies that come from the national level are the most important incentives for the local level to do something about these drought issues. Now here comes the empirical evidence for the enterprises and the households. We've looked to about 14 possible policies for drought mitigation. And so on the one hand, on the left you see the possible measures, and on the right side you see the result of the data my postdoc collected in one of the 2 districts, this Puer district, interviewing about 60 households. What evidence do we find of these policies? And we do find evidence, but we will, in the next slide, after this one, link to what extent they have adopted these policies, these measures, to the policies, or whether they acted on their own behalf. So, just to show you some examples, the farmers try to get water, from other sources. They may be digging wells, and that's of course where the local enterprises also come in, because they have the knowledge, and they serve these farmers. And if the farmers are organized in some kind of collective structure, we call it emerging governance structures, and we find some evidence for newly emerging governance structures in the rural areas, in this case in the Yunnan province. So there's a lot of evidence that things are going on, and so the real question is then, is it linked to the policies or not? So here we tried to establish that relation. It's of course highly qualitative, these are indications. But what we found is that very often people do things, like in this case a simple rotation, or building a simple tank, where there is no policy and no incentive. And it's one of the indications of what we think is the most important finding of this research, is that there's a lot of agency at the local level of farmers, entrepreneurs, being forced by the drought to do something because they feel that the national policies are not reaching them and have no effect. And that seems to be a process of, well, democratization is maybe too much, but at least participation from below in this development process, which we think is quite unique in China. Here you see the number of yellow increasing tremendously. So activities of the farmers and the entrepreneurs which are not related to policy and where there is no incentive, but these things happen because they want to deal with the issues of drought and climate change. So I've tried to summarize it in this table where I say there are two types of reactions. There's a passive reaction where you wait, will the government help us? And then there are active reactions. And the active reactions we distinguished in three categories. Active, traditional, where you use the existing governance structures. And for example, there the elected natural village leaders would try to mobilize funds at a higher level for certain activities at the lowest level. But what of course is interesting is the active new and developing or emerging governance structures and the active individual reactions. And there we found a number of examples, and I've put two here. The governance structures, if the farmers work together to build structures that assure, for example, more supply of irrigation water, and at the individual level where they choose for alternative options. Instead of irrigated agriculture, they may move to planting trees, using cattle. And we notice that the local companies play a very catalyzing role in the Chinese situation. 3 more slides and then I'm through. So first, let's depict, what comes from the national level and reaches the farmers. And here you see examples like the technology promotion, liberalizing the land market, the seed companies supplying more appropriate seeds, and organizing the community to undertake infrastructural works. This is the more traditional part. But now, let's look at the new phenomenon. And here we see from below, they develop water trading during the drought period. While in China there are no what we call water markets, so where you could buy or sell irrigation water. The informal mechanisms of working elsewhere or supporting each other, and the cooperation in constructing all kinds of infrastructure. To some extent, the farmers in these emerging governance structures use the existing water user associations and may go in the direction of developing a water market as a reality on the ground, from below. So we thought these are very interesting developments. So my final slide with some conclusions. So the first one, must be clear that a lot of the policies that I've listed in the early part are not implemented at the local level because of the weak intermediary government structures and the lack of suitable organizations to actually implement them, if not for a lack of funds. So what we found is that the local government is very good in dealing with emergency disasters. So that's much better organized in China than anticipating this climate change and its consequences. The third flash is about the policies encouraging the community to become stronger and to start playing a role. And to some extent they take that up. And I think then the fourth one is the most important one. We noticed that the farmers now try to self-organize themselves to deal with the drought. And so we have a few recommendations, and of course that you may always argue, is that really what is needed? But we think, that it's very important to try to enhance this adaptive capacity, enhance the coordination between the different departments and the different levels of government. And we also think that decentralization, would help. And of course, the bottom line is that the rural entrepreneurs and farmers should be involved much more in decision making than that's what is currently the case. But I think the most interesting part of it is this growing agency at the local level, where you still have the impression of China, of this very hierarchical state where everything is controlled from above, and it doesn't seem to work anymore in these circumstances. Thank you very much.